The stagecoach driver did not even look back when he kicked her weathered wooden trunk into the snowbank and cracked his long leather whip. The heavy iron-rimmed wheels ground violently against the frozen mud, leaving Evelyn entirely alone at the base of the treacherous mountain pass. The freezing wind immediately bit through the thin, faded floral fabric of her dress. She pulled her worn, frayed woolen shawl much tighter around her fragile shoulders, shivering violently as the harsh reality of her situation settled deep into her bones. The truth of why a young, delicate widow was abandoned in the deadly high country was far more complicated than a simple navigational error or a driver in a hurry. It was a desperate gamble for survival, a choice made by a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Stay until the very end of this memory to hear how a grandmother's heavy cast iron skillet and a few meager handfuls of ground cornmeal ended up changing the fate of 30 starving lumberjacks. And please, take a moment to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are listening from today, so I can see just how far this old mountain tale travels. Evelyn watched the stagecoach disappear around the bend, taking with it her last connection to civilization. The silence that followed was immense, heavy, and terrifying. Snowflakes, sharp as shattered glass, began to spiral down from a bruised, slate-gray sky. She looked down at her small, mud-stained leather boots. They were already soaking wet, offering no real protection against the bitter earth. Taking a slow, trembling breath, she reached into the snowbank and retrieved the only two possessions she truly valued: a small canvas sack of yellow cornmeal and a massive, blackened cast iron skillet. The skillet was absurdly heavy for a woman of her petite stature, but she clutched it to her chest like a warrior holding a sacred shield. She turned her face toward the towering, jagged peaks. Somewhere up there, hidden within the ancient pines, was a remote timber camp. It was her only hope for shelter, her only chance to find work, and her only way to escape the crushing debts that had chased her out of the valley below. None. The climb was agonizing. Every step forced her to drag her skirts through knee-deep snowdrifts. The delicate white and pastel fabric of her dress tore against sharp briars and jagged rocks, leaving the hem ragged and caked with freezing mud. Her lungs burned with the thin, icy air, and her pale hands grew numb around the handle of the iron pan. Yet, behind her strikingly beautiful, sorrowful eyes, a quiet resilience burned brightly. She refused to stop. She refused to let the mountain claim her. She simply placed one freezing foot in front of the other, hour after hour, driven by a profound, desperate will to live. By the time she finally smelled the faint, sharp scent of wood smoke, the afternoon light was dying. She stumbled over a snow-covered ridge and found herself looking down into a vast, muddy clearing. Massive felled logs were stacked like giant barricades. Plumes of thick gray smoke rose from the stone chimneys of rough-hewn wooden cabins. As Evelyn descended into the camp, the rhythmic, deafening sound of axes striking timber suddenly ceased. One by one, 30 massive, hardened lumberjacks lowered their tools. They turned, staring in stunned silence at the apparition, wandering into their brutal world. Evelyn froze in the center of the muddy yard. She looked impossibly small, a fragile porcelain figure surrounded by towering, dangerous men. The men were filthy, covered in sawdust and sweat, their faces obscured by thick beards and layers of grime. They looked at her, not with warmth, but with heavy, suspicious stares. Evelyn clutched her shawl tighter, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She was terrified, fully aware of how utterly defenseless she truly was in this lawless place. The crowd of men parted slowly, making way for a figure who made the others look small in comparison. Silas stepped out from the shadow of the main cabin. He was a mountain of a man, possessing an extremely large, muscular build that strained against the coarse fabric of his worn-out shirt. Broad shoulders, thick forearms, and a bulging, bodybuilder physique commanded absolute authority. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his weathered, tanned face, while sharp, angular features and piercing eyes analyzed her with cold precision. His messy, shoulder-length hair swept across his collar, and a heavy, brutal fur coat was draped carelessly over one shoulder. He wore a weathered cowboy hat pulled low, casting a dark shadow over his unreadable expression. He stopped a few paces away from her. The physical contrast between them was staggering. She was slender, delicate, and shivering violently. He was an immovable force of nature, radiating stoic power and a terrifying stillness. "You are trespassing on a private timber claim." His voice rumbled low and deep, carrying effortlessly over the howling wind. Evelyn swallowed hard, trying to force the trembling out of her jaw. She lifted her chin, meeting his intense gaze with a sudden, desperate bravery. "I am looking for work." Her voice was soft, melodic, yet remarkably steady despite the cold. "I can cook. I can clean. I ask only for a place by the fire and a fraction of your rations." Silas stared down at her pale, beautiful face, noting the purple hue of her lips and the violent shaking of her small frame. He looked at the heavy iron skillet clutched in her delicate, bruised hands. Then, his sharp eyes scanned the darkening horizon. "We do not hire women." He stepped closer, towering over her, his immense shadow swallowing her entirely. "We do not have the supplies to feed strays. The winter is going to be brutal, and every ounce of flour is spoken for by the men who swing the axes." "I am not a stray," Evelyn countered firmly, refusing to step back, even as her legs threatened to give way from sheer exhaustion. "I will earn every single crumb you give me. I know how to stretch a meal. I know how to make something out of absolutely nothing." The camp was dead silent. The lumberjacks watched their giant foreman, waiting for his command. Silas was a man governed by strict honor and the heavy burden of keeping his rough crew alive. Rations were indeed dwindling. The snow was already piling up against the cabin walls, and the pass would soon be entirely impassable. Feeding another mouth, especially a fragile widow who looked as though a stiff winter breeze might break her in half, was a dangerous liability. It was a risk he had no right to take with his men's lives. The blizzard intensified, whipping Evelyn's long, dark hair across her pale cheeks. She swayed slightly on her feet, the last remnants of her physical strength finally failing her. She gripped the heavy skillet, her knuckles turning completely white. Silas crossed his massive, muscular arms over his broad chest. His face remained entirely composed, a mask of unyielding stone. The silence stretched between them, growing heavier and deadlier than the rapidly falling snow. Would he turn this desperate, freezing woman back out into the deadly whiteout to protect the survival of his crew? Or would the stoic giant risk the wrath of his starving men by offering her a place by his fire? Silas watched the fragile woman sway in the biting wind. Her pale face was devoid of all color, her massive eyes wide with a desperate, silent plea. The massive lumberjack did not soften his imposing expression, nor did he offer a welcoming hand to steady her trembling frame. He simply uncrossed his heavy, muscular arms and stepped aside, gesturing toward a long, low building constructed of rough pine logs. "The mess hall is through that door," Silas rumbled, his deep voice carrying a harsh, unyielding authority. "You have exactly 1 hour to prove you are worth the air you breathe." Evelyn dragged her freezing leather boots across the muddy, snow-covered yard. The massive men parted slowly, their eyes tracking her, every single movement, with heavy, undisguised hostility. She pushed open the heavy wooden door of the mess hall. A wall of glorious, life-saving heat washed over her frozen face. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far end of the long room, roaring with a fierce, crackling pine fire. However, the kitchen area was a scene of absolute, chaotic devastation. Dirty tin plates were stacked hazardously high. The thick wooden counters were covered in a deep layer of grease and grime. Evelyn placed her heavy cast iron skillet onto the wooden table. She completely ignored the agonizing pain returning to her frozen fingers as the blood rushed back into her hands. She had an impossible task ahead of her. She opened the large wooden larder doors, praying for a miracle. Her heart sank deeply into her stomach. The shelves were nearly bare. There were no cured meats, no dried apples, no root vegetables. The previous cook had clearly abandoned his post long before the snow began to fall. She found only a half-empty canvas sack of coarse white flour, a small glass jar containing precious white sugar, a tin of rendered pork lard, and a single wooden bucket of fresh well water. The hostile men filed into the hall behind her, sitting heavily at the long, scarred wooden tables. They crossed their thick arms, and watching her with grim, unforgiving expectation. They fully expected her to fail this brutal test. They fully expected their giant foreman to cast her back out into the freezing wilderness before the moon rose above the pines. Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief, silent moment. She remembered her grandmother standing in a cramped, sunlit kitchen during the absolute hardest years of her own youth. She remembered the profound magic of making something out of nothing, of creating warmth and comfort when the world offered only bitter hardship. She washed her pale hands vigorously in a tin basin. She tied a clean, frayed cloth around her slender waist. Her movements shifted dramatically, from trembling exhaustion to practiced, graceful precision. She scooped a careful measure of flour into a wooden bowl, cutting in the cold lard with a rusty fork until the mixture resembled coarse mountain sand. She pressed the delicate, crumbly dough firmly into the bottom of her grandmother's cast iron skillet, creating a perfect, fluted crust along the heavy black edges. The men murmured loudly, their harsh voices filling the stifling room with heavy doubt. She ignored them completely. She mixed a small tin cup of pure, cold well water with a heavy handful of white sugar and a very light dusting of flour. She poured the clear liquid directly into the center of the unbaked crust. It looked like an absolute disaster. It looked exactly like a puddle of sweet water sitting inside raw dough, destined to turn the pastry into an inedible, soggy mess. She placed the heavy iron pan deep into the roaring oven beside the main hearth, closed the heavy iron door, and stepped back to wipe the sweat from her pale brow. The cabin remained thick with tension. The deadly blizzard raged outside, rattling the thick glass panes with terrifying violence. Inside, the heat of the fire slowly performed a forgotten miracle. As the liquid boiled fiercely within the crust, the small amount of flour and sugar bound together with the bubbling water, transforming slowly into a rich, golden, translucent custard. A sweet, buttery aroma began to fill the harsh, masculine space. It was an aroma that belonged deeply to warm childhood kitchens, to safety, to Sunday afternoons spent with family. The harsh, doubting murmurs of the lumberjacks faded away entirely. Massive heads lifted from the wooden tables. Wide noses sniffed the sweet air. The heavy hostility in the room began to melt, replaced by a quiet, collective, and desperate hunger. When Evelyn pulled the cast iron skillet from the oven, the pie was bubbling and perfectly golden brown. She set it on the center table to cool. The clear water had magically set into a firm, sweet, caramelized filling. She cut the pie into precise, even slices, serving the giant men on clean tin plates. A scarred, terrifyingly large logger named Thomas took the very first bite. He chewed slowly. His rough, weathered eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. "This is pure magic," Thomas whispered, staring at the fragile widow with profound, sudden reverence. "It tastes like rich butter and sweet vanilla, but I know for a fact, we do not have a single drop of either in this cursed camp." Evelyn offered a tiny, exhausted, but genuine smile. "It is a water pie. It is what you make when the world gives you nothing but hardship and a cup of water." A visible ripple of grudging respect washed through the entire mess hall. The rough men ate in reverent silence, savoring the impossible sweetness. Evelyn had proven her immense worth. She had secured her absolute right to a place by the fire. Silas stood in the shadowy corner of the room, observing the entire spectacle in absolute silence. His massive frame was perfectly still, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing loudly against the wooden floorboards. He stopped in front of Evelyn, towering over her petite frame. He reached out and took a small tin plate from her delicate hands. Their fingers brushed briefly. His hands were heavily calloused, rough, and radiating heat, while hers were still icy and trembling slightly from the sheer physical exertion. Silas stared down at the golden slice of pie. He lifted his fork and took a small, deliberate bite. The moment the sweet, buttery custard touched his tongue, his massive, towering body went entirely rigid. The color drained completely from his weathered, tanned face. His sharp, masculine features twisted into an expression of sudden, unbearable emotional agony. His broad chest heaved violently beneath his tight, coarse shirt. He dropped the tin fork. It clattered loudly against the wooden table, completely shattering the peaceful silence of the hall. The men stopped eating, staring at their massive foreman in absolute shock. Silas did not utter a single word. He turned sharply, pushed open the heavy wooden door, and walked straight out into the howling, deadly blizzard, leaving his heavy fur coat sitting on the wooden chair behind him. Evelyn stared at the violently swinging door, her heart pounding with a sudden, icy dread. Why did the simple, sweet taste of a Depression-era water pie completely break the impenetrable composure of the stoic giant? And what terrible memory had she unknowingly resurrected from his dark past? Evelyn did not hesitate. She grabbed the heavy fur coat from the back of the wooden chair and stepped straight out into the roaring whiteout. The freezing wind screamed through the high mountain pines, threatening to rip her thin shawl right off her fragile shoulders. The blinding snow bit into her eyes, but she could easily see the massive, dark silhouette of Silas standing motionless by the edge of the steep cliff face. He looked like an ancient stone monument, completely indifferent to the ice, caking his long hair and dark beard. She approached him slowly, her petite frame buffeted by the vicious gusts. She held out the massive fur coat, her voice barely carrying over the howling gale. "You left your coat," Evelyn murmured, standing as close to his massive back as she dared. "The cold will take a man's life before he even realizes he is freezing." Silas did not turn around. His massive shoulders remained perfectly rigid, his thick arms crossed over his broad chest. The coarse fabric of his shirt was already covered in a thick layer of white frost. "You should be inside," Silas rumbled, his deep voice sounding hollow and entirely drained of its usual commanding power. "A fragile thing like you has no business standing out here in the dark." "I am stronger than I look," Evelyn replied softly, stepping closer to place the heavy fur coat over his massive, trembling shoulders. And I know what it looks like when a person is running away from a memory. The pie reminded you of someone, did it not? Silas closed his sharp eyes, a heavy, ragged sigh escaping his lips. He finally turned to face her, his towering height completely blocking out the icy wind for her. His weathered, tanned face was filled with a profound, raw sorrow that made him look human rather than monstrous. My wife used to make that very same pie, Silas whispered, his deep voice cracking under the immense weight of the confession. Years ago, down in the valley during the great drought. We had absolutely nothing left but a sack of flour and water. She would bake it to make our little girls smile. I lost them both to the scarlet fever that very same winter. The sweetness of that pie is the exact taste of everything I failed to protect. Evelyn felt a deep, piercing ache in her chest. She looked up at the giant man, seeing the shattering grief behind his stoic mask. She reached out, her delicate, pale fingers gently brushing against his massive, calloused hand. You did not fail them, Silas, Evelyn breathed, her voice filled with a genuine, healing warmth. You survived to keep these men alive. There is great honor in that. Silas stared down at her small, gentle hand resting against his rough skin. A profound, unreadable expression passed through his sharp eyes. He pulled his hand back slowly, closing his heart once more behind his impenetrable walls. But the heavy hostility was entirely gone. He gestured for her to return to the warmth of the mess hall. The next morning, the camp awoke to a quiet, crystalline world. The storm had passed, leaving behind 3 feet of fresh, powdery snow. Evelyn was up before the dawn, her body aching from the previous day's journey, but her spirit remained unbroken. She entered the kitchen, determined to prepare a hearty breakfast for the hard-working men. She walked straight to the large wooden larder, intending to check the rest of the supplies. She opened the low-bottom bins, expecting to find the standard sacks of winter potatoes and salted pork. Instead, a cold wave of absolute horror washed over her. The bottom of the wooden bins was covered in a thick, black, furry mold. A terrible, sour smell filled the small kitchen space. The previous cook had stored the remaining bags of potatoes directly against a leaking water pipe. Every single potato was rotten, turned into a soft, caking black mush that was completely inedible. The sacks of salted pork were riddled with weevils, the meat ruined by damp rot. They had absolutely nothing left except for 3 small bags of hard pinto beans, a half sack of cornmeal, and a tiny pile of bruised, discarded potatoes that had somehow remained dry on the top shelf. Evelyn sat down heavily on a wooden stool, her pale hands covering her face. Panic threatened to choke her. 30 massive, hard-working lumberjacks required thousands of calories a day to swing their heavy iron axes in the freezing cold. If they found out the food supplies were entirely ruined, the camp would devolve into absolute chaos. The men would mutiny, or worse, they would abandon the claim and attempt to trek down the mountain, a choice that would surely cost them their lives in the deep snow. The heavy door opened, and Silas stepped into the kitchen. He took one look at Evelyn's pale, trembling form in the open, rotting bins, and his entire body went perfectly still. How bad is it? Silas asked, his voice low and deadly serious. The meat is entirely gone, Evelyn whispered, looking up at him with wide, frightened eyes. The main potato store is caked in black rot. We have barely anything left for the entire winter. I have only a handful of bruised potatoes that are fit for human consumption. Silas walked over to the bins, examining the devastation with a grim, tight jaw. The lines around his sharp eyes deepened with immense stress. He turned back to Evelyn, his massive physique towering over her small frame. The men cannot swing axes on empty stomachs, Silas muttered, his voice strained. If they find out, fear will tear this camp apart. I must keep them working, and you must find a way to keep them fed. Can you do it, Evelyn? Evelyn looked at the tiny pile of bruised, discarded potatoes on the upper counter. They were small, covered in black spots, and looked entirely worthless. Yet, as she looked into the sharp, desperate eyes of the giant foreman, a fierce, protective maternal instinct awoke within her quiet soul. She would not let these men starve. She would not let Silas face this crushing failure alone. I will find a way, Evelyn said firmly, her voice ringing with a sudden, beautiful strength. I will take the heavy burden of rationing upon my own shoulders. But you must promise to keep the men away from the kitchen. They must not see what I am working with. Silas nodded once, a profound look of gratitude and dawning attachment softening his rugged features. He reached out, his massive hand hovering over her slender shoulder for a brief second before he pulled it back, maintaining his strict emotional restraint. Evelyn turned back to the counter, grabbing her grandmother's heavy cast iron skillet and a sharp paring knife. She began to carefully cut away the black spots from the bruised potatoes, saving every single scrap of clean white flesh she could find. She had to create a rich, filling meal out of garbage and faith. As the sun began to rise over the snowy peaks, the heavy footsteps of 30 hungry lumberjacks echoed outside the mess hall door. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs as she placed her massive pot of water onto the roaring fire. Can she truly transform a pile of discarded, bruised potatoes into something that will prevent a violent camp mutiny? Or will the harsh truth blow wide open before the first bowl is served? The heavy iron pot bubbled fiercely over the roaring hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow against the cold stone walls of the kitchen. Evelyn worked with a frantic, desperate grace. She diced the small, salvaged pieces of white potato into perfectly uniform cubes, ensuring they would cook evenly and release their natural starches into the rolling water. She stood on her tiptoes, searching the high wooden rafters of the ruined larder until her delicate, pale fingers brushed against a dusty, forgotten bundle of dried wild mountain onions. She crumbled the brittle, pungent herbs directly into the bubbling water. The sharp, savory scent immediately cut through the damp, oppressive cold of the kitchen space, bringing a sudden memory of spring meadows to the frozen mountain. To stretch the thin broth, she browned a small handful of coarse flour in her grandmother's cast iron skillet, creating a thick, rich paste using a tiny scrape of the remaining pork lard. When she whisked the heavy roux into the boiling water, the pathetic liquid transformed almost magically into a thick, hearty, velvety stew. It was a humble meal, born entirely of poverty and absolute necessity, yet it smelled of warmth, safety, and home. The heavy wooden door of the mess hall swung open with a violent crash. 30 freezing, exhausted lumberjacks piled into the large room, stomping heavy clumps of snow from their thick leather boots. They were loud, their massive voices filling space with rough jokes and demands for food. Evelyn stood behind the long wooden serving table, her fragile posture completely straight, hiding her internal terror behind a mask of quiet, unwavering dignity. She held a large tin ladle, ready to face the judgment of the starving men. Thomas approached first, holding out his battered tin bowl. Evelyn filled it to the very brim with the thick, steaming potato soup. He took a heavy wooden spoon, blew on the hot liquid, and took a massive bite. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. Thomas closed his eyes, a deep groan of pure satisfaction escaping his rough throat. The rich, savory flavor of the wild onions and the heavy, filling texture of the thickened broth completely masked the tragic reality of their ruined supplies. The men quickly formed a desperate line, holding out their battered bowls with eager, hungry hands. They ate loudly, laughing and praising the fragile widow, who had seemingly worked a pure miracle in the dark, freezing kitchen. They did not suspect a single thing. Silas stood in the far corner of the bustling room, his massive, muscular arms crossed over his broad chest. His sharp, masculine eyes tracked Evelyn's every single movement. He watched as she served bowl after bowl, offering a gentle smile and a kind nod to every hardened man who passed her table. She did not rush them. She did not complain about her own exhaustion. She treated the rough, unwashed lumberjacks with a profound, unyielding dignity, pouring out warmth and grace as freely as she poured the hearty broth. When the massive iron pot was nearly empty, the men began to clear the tables, their bellies full and their spirits completely lifted. Evelyn finally lowered the heavy tin ladle. Her delicate shoulders slumped slightly. She took a small, chipped bowl from the wooden counter and scraped the very bottom of the iron pot. She managed to gather only a few meager spoonfuls of the starchy broth for herself. Before she could lift the wooden spoon to her pale lips, a massive shadow fell across her small table. Silas stood directly before her, his towering physique blocking the light from the roaring hearth. He reached out with his large, calloused hand and gently pulled the chipped bowl away from her grip. Evelyn looked up, her large, sorrowful eyes wide with sudden confusion. Silas did not speak right away. He turned to the wooden counter and picked up his own untouched bowl of soup. He placed it gently down in front of her. It was completely full, steaming in the cool air of the room. "You must eat, Evelyn," Silas rumbled, his deep voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre that was meant only for her ears. "You gave every single ounce of your strength to keep these men fed. You scraped the bottom of the pot so they would not go hungry. I see exactly what you are doing, and I will not allow you to starve yourself in my camp." Evelyn stared at the full bowl of steaming soup, a sudden, hot tear slipping down her pale cheek. She had spent her entire adult life taking care of others, sacrificing her own needs to pay debts she did not owe, and surviving on the absolute bare minimum. No one had ever stopped to make sure she was fed. No one had ever noticed her quiet, desperate sacrifices. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling with profound, unexpected emotion. Silas simply nodded, his sharp features softening in the dim light of the roaring hearth. He felt a strange, powerful warmth blooming within his heavily guarded chest. For the first time since he lost his family, he felt a genuine sense of emotional safety. He realized that this fragile, delicate widow possessed a heart as fiercely protective as his own. She was not a liability. She was a true partner in survival. The quiet, intimate moment was suddenly shattered. The heavy wooden door of the mess hall burst open with a terrifying, violent force. The freezing wind howled through the room, blowing out the oil lanterns on the nearest tables. A man stumbled through the doorway, collapsing onto the wooden floorboards in a heap of snow and frozen mud. It was Elias, the young scout Silas had sent down the mountain 3 days ago to secure the next delivery of winter supplies. Silas moved with terrifying speed. He rushed across the room, his massive hands grabbing the young scout by his heavy coat and pulling him upright. Elias was completely blue in the face, shivering violently, his clothes torn and caked in solid ice. "Elias," Silas barked, his commanding voice cutting through the sudden panic in the room. "Report." The young scout gasped for air, looking up at his giant foreman with wild, terrified eyes. He clutched Silas's thick forearm, his freezing fingers digging into the coarse fabric of the shirt. "The pass," Elias gasped, his voice barely a rasping whisper. I barely made it back alive. The entire mess hall fell deathly silent. The men stood frozen, their eyes locked on the trembling scout. Evelyn stepped out from behind the wooden serving table, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She recognized the look of absolute despair in the young man's eyes. It was the very same look she had seen in her own mirror for months. Elias swallowed hard, shivering violently under the heavy gaze of the 30 massive lumberjacks. He delivered the news that would change the fate of every single soul trapped on the mountain. What terrifying message had the freezing scout brought back through the deadly snow? And how would it instantly shatter the fragile peace Evelyn had just fought so desperately to build? Elias pulled his gaze away from Silas, his eyes darting frantically around the silent, crowded room. The young scout was pale, his lips blue from the biting cold, and his fingers were curled into rigid claws. Silas kept his massive, calloused hand firmly on the man's shoulder, anchoring him while simultaneously demanding the truth. Speak. Elias, Silas commanded, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, quiet intensity. Tell me exactly what you found at the base of the pass. The scout swallowed, a painful, clicking sound in the sudden stillness of the hall. The bridge at the river bend is gone. Silas. The heavy spring thaw came too early, and the mountain runoff turned the gorge into a raging, ice-choked torrent. Then, the latest storm hit, causing a massive rock slide that has buried the entire trail under 10 feet of stone and packed ice. No wagon can pass. No mule train can make it through. The supply route is completely severed until the late summer melt. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the men. The implications were catastrophic. They were isolated at the top of the world, with no hope of resupply, no way to trade their timber, and, most importantly, no way to bring in the massive stocks of flour, beans, and meat required to survive the long, brutal months ahead. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at the dwindling supplies in her mind. The meager sacks of beans, the small amount of cornmeal, and the absolute lack of any protein source. She had saved them for one meal, but she could not save them for a season. Silas stood tall, his massive physique acting as a bulwark against the rising panic in the room. He did not look at the men, nor did he look at the mess hall's crumbling walls. He looked directly at Evelyn. His sharp, angular face remained composed, but the way he tightened his grip on the scout's shoulder revealed the immense pressure he was under. He was the protector, the immovable force, but he was currently holding a collapsing structure together with his bare hands. Go to the barracks, Silas ordered the scout, his voice steady and ironclad. Get out of those frozen clothes. Wrap yourself in the heavy wool blankets. And drink the warm broth Evelyn has waiting. You are done with the mountain for now. As the men helped Elias away, the room began to fracture. Whispers started to snake through the tables, doubts about the food, fear of the coming starvation, and the dark, simmering anger of men who knew their odds of survival had just plummeted. Evelyn watched as the men returned to their seats, but their posture was different. They were slumped, their movements sluggish and heavy. The light of hope she had sparked with her simple potato soup was being extinguished by the crushing reality of the news. She turned to the kitchen, her mind racing. She needed to be more than just a cook. She needed to be a lifeline. Silas walked over to the serving table, his massive shadow looming over her. The proximity of him was overwhelming. He smelled of cold pine, hard work, and deep, ancient sorrow. We are trapped, Evelyn, he said, his voice barely a murmur. You heard what the boy said. I cannot promise them safety anymore. I cannot even promise them bread. Evelyn looked up at him, her large eyes filled with a sudden, fierce resolve. She did not let herself feel the fear. She channeled it into a singular purpose. She reached out and placed her small, pale hand on his thick forearm, right over the coarse fabric of his shirt. He was rigid, his muscles coiled like coiled iron, but he did not pull away. We are not trapped, Evelyn replied, her voice firm and ringing with an unexpected authority. We are only isolated. There is a difference. If we stay together, if we manage what we have with absolute precision, we can endure this. Silas looked down at her hand on his arm. His expression flickered, a brief, startling display of vulnerability, before he shuttered his emotions away again. You talk like a woman who has survived the impossible before. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She thought of her late husband, the man who had gambled away their home and left her with nothing but a skillet and a mountain of debt. She thought of the cold, hungry nights she had endured before finding this camp. She had learned that survival was not just about food. It was about dignity and the refusal to let one's humanity rot away along with the supplies. I have survived enough to know that a man who loses his hope is already dead, she whispered. Do not tell them about the lack of meat yet. We will stretch the beans. We will make tea from pine needles for the nutrients. We will keep them busy. If their minds are occupied, they will not think of their empty bellies. Silas looked at her for a long, silent moment. In his eyes, she saw the shift. It was not just admiration. It was a profound, dawning reliance. He was a man who had carried the world on his shoulders for years. And for the first time, he was allowing someone to help him bear the weight. Very well, Silas rumbled, his voice thick with emotion. I will keep them working. You keep them fed. If we are to survive, we do it on your terms. As he turned to leave the mess hall, the men fell silent. They watched their giant foreman and the small, delicate widow. They did not understand the nature of the conversation, but they saw the way Silas looked at her, with a strange, protective reverence. Evelyn walked back to her station, but her heart was hammering. She had committed herself to an impossible task, and she had entangled her fate with the most dangerous, beautiful, and broken man she had ever met. The wind shrieked outside, a cruel, mocking sound. The cabin groaned under the pressure of the accumulating snow. Evelyn turned toward the empty larder, her hands trembling as she pulled out the final bag of dried beans. How would she explain the sudden transition to a nearly vegan, meager diet to 30 men who were accustomed to heavy, protein-rich rations? And what would happen when the first of them realized was hiding their giant protector, was hiding the true severity of the situation? The weeks that followed the news of the blocked pass dragged on like a slow, agonizing funeral procession. The relentless winter wind howled against the rough-hewn logs of the camp, carrying the suffocating weight of isolation. Inside the mess hall, the air grew thick with a new, dangerous quality, a volatile mixture of physical hunger and psychological exhaustion. The men, who had once been brothers in iron and timber, now found themselves rubbing against one another like jagged stones in a riverbed. Evelyn felt the mounting pressure in every fiber of her being. She managed the meager rations with the discipline of an accountant, stretching the pinto beans into soups so thin they were nearly transparent. She served them with a gentle grace that belied her own gnawing ache, but she could see the spirit of the camp eroding. The men were quiet, their eyes hooded and dark, their movements lethargic. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening when the thermometer dropped low enough to crack the timber outside. Brock, a massive, foul-tempered logger known for his temper, slammed his empty tin bowl against the heavy wooden table with a force that made the dishes rattle. The sound cut through the room like a gunshot. 30 pairs of tired, hollow eyes snapped toward him. I am finished with this slop, Brock growled, standing up and looming over the table. He was a man of immense physical power, and his anger was a tangible, threatening force. He turned his gaze toward Silas, who stood near the hearth, his arms crossed over his massive chest, watching the room with a sentinel's patience. You keep telling us the supply wagon is delayed. You tell us we must ration. But look at us. We are turning into skeletons. We should be hacking our way down the mountain, not sitting here, waiting to rot in the cold. The room erupted in low, dangerous murmurs. The men began to rise, their heavy boots thumping against the floorboards. The sense of hierarchy, of order, and of the collective survival Silas had enforced threatened to dissolve into a chaotic, desperate mutiny. Silas did not move. He did not raise his voice. He simply lowered his chin, his sharp, angular features sharpening into a look of predatory focus. He was preparing to break the rebellion with his own two hands, a choice that would surely result in blood spilled on the floor of the very sanctuary he had fought to protect. Evelyn, sensing the impending violence, did not hide in the kitchen. She stepped out, her slight frame appearing impossibly delicate against the backdrop of the towering, angry men. She carried her grandmother's heavy, cast-iron skillet, still warm from the hearth, and a wooden bowl of golden yellow cornmeal batter. "Sit down," she said, her voice soft but possessing a sudden, ringing clarity that commanded the entire space. Brock sneered, his face twisting with condescension. "Move aside, woman. This does not concern you." Evelyn did not retreat. She walked to the center of the room, her movements purposeful and calm. She set the iron skillet directly onto the center table, right in the middle of the confrontation. She began to drop spoonfuls of the thick, textured batter into the hot, seasoned metal. The sound was an immediate, rhythmic hiss, a sound that filled the vacuum of the room. The scent of browning corn, toasted and earthy, began to waft through the freezing air. It was a smell that spoke of summer harvest, of southern warmth, and of home. The men paused. Their focus shifted from the anger in their chests to the undeniable, primal draw of food being prepared with care. "I have no more meat," Evelyn stated. Her eyes locked on Brock's, her demeanor unflinching. "I have no more flour, but I have corn. And I know how to make it taste like comfort." She flipped the hoe cakes with a rhythmic, graceful motion of her wrist. The crispy, golden brown edges crackled in the heat. She did not look at the men with fear, but with the quiet, persistent authority of someone who had faced far worse than a few hungry laborers. "This camp is led by a man who has sacrificed everything to ensure you are warm and safe tonight," she continued, her voice gaining strength, echoing off the wooden rafters. "When the pass opens, we will have plenty. But until then, you have two choices. You can tear this place down and die in the snow, or you can sit, eat, and remember that you are men of dignity." She plated the first hoe cake and slid it across the table toward Brock. The giant, angry man hesitated. He looked at the steaming, golden cake, then at the fragile woman who stood her ground before him. He slowly sank back into his bench. He took a bite. The sound of his chewing was the only noise in the room. "It is good," Brock muttered, his voice stripped of its earlier, vitriolic edge. One by one, the men returned to their seats. The tension did not vanish, but it evaporated, replaced by a quiet, collective hunger that was being satisfied. Silas remained by the wall, his chest heaving slightly, his hand loosening from his belt. He watched Evelyn with a look of profound, dawning awe. She had just prevented a violent uprising with nothing more than a skillet and a calm, unwavering spirit. Later that night, when the camp had settled into a heavy, snoring silence, Evelyn returned to the larder to secure the remaining supplies. She moved with a tired, weary grace, her heart still hammering from the day's events. She reached for the burlap sack of cornmeal, intending to move it to the upper, safer shelf. As her fingers gripped the material, her brow furrowed. The sack felt significantly lighter than it had when she measured the ingredients that morning. She lifted it, shaking it gently. There was barely a third of what should have been left. She pulled the neck of the bag open and looked inside, her blood running cold. The level of the meal had been deliberately lowered. It had not been used in the cooking. It had been taken. Panic flared in her chest, sharp and bright. Someone had been stealing from the communal ration, potentially putting every man in the camp at risk of starvation. She looked at the shadows of the mess hall, wondering who would be desperate enough to gamble with the lives of their brothers. Why would someone steal the very sustenance that was keeping them all alive? And how could she possibly address the theft without sparking the very mutiny she had just worked so hard to quell? The revelation of the stolen cornmeal settled into Evelyn's stomach like a cold stone. She stood in the dim, freezing light of the early morning, staring at the empty, jagged edges of the burlap sack. Her hands, usually so steady when handling the heavy cast iron skillet, trembled. She had sacrificed her own portions. She had spent every waking moment scouring the larder for edible scraps, and she had faced down the anger of 30 hungry men to keep the peace. To discover that someone within this circle of survival was actively sabotaging the camp, and by extension, undermining her own desperate efforts, felt like a physical blow. She could not sleep. She spent the remaining hours of the night huddled by the dying embers of the hearth, watching the shadows of the mess hall, waiting for the thief to return. But no one came. The camp remained deathly silent, save for the low, rhythmic snoring of 30 men who had no idea how precarious their existence truly was. When the sun finally began to bleed over the jagged mountain peaks, painting the snow in shades of pale violet, Evelyn rose to prepare the morning meal. Her heart was heavy. She scraped the bottom of the cornmeal sack, yielding barely enough for a single, watery porridge. It would not be enough. She knew that the moment she served this, the men would realize the supply had diminished drastically overnight. As the first bell tolled, the men filed into the room, their movements stiff and sluggish from the cold. They sat at the long wooden tables, their eyes fixed on the kitchen service window with a predatory focus. They were waiting for the promise of warmth, the promise of sustenance that she had provided the night before. Evelyn set the large pot down. She ladled the thin, gray liquid into the tin bowls. When she reached Brock, who sat near the front, he stared into his bowl, his brow furrowed. He looked up at her, his eyes narrowing. "This is not a hoe cake," Brock rumbled, his voice low and vibrating with a building, ugly menace. "This is nothing but hot water and dust." Evelyn gripped the handle of her ladle, her knuckles white. "The supplies have been depleted. Brock, we must ration until the next shipment can be cleared." The room erupted. The men began to grumble, the sound rising like the rumble of an approaching avalanche. "She is skimming," a voice shouted from the back. "She is feeding herself and hiding the rest." Evelyn shook her head, her voice rising to meet the chaos. "I have not taken a single ounce of meal for myself. I have given you every grain." "Liar," another man shouted. He stood up, knocking his bench backward. "She is an outsider. She came to us with nothing, And now that we are starving, she hoards the little we have in her private quarters. She is the reason we are hungry. The accusation hit her with the force of a physical strike. It was a cruel, sharp twisting of the truth. She looked around the room, expecting anyone, to stand in her defense. But the hunger had turned the men's hearts into cold, suspicious iron. They saw her not as their savior, but as the source of their misery. Open her trunk, someone suggested, the voice fueled by a desperate, ugly greed. Check the larder. She is stealing from us. The men rose in unison. They were no longer a crew of brothers. They were a mob. They surged forward, closing the distance between their tables and the kitchen partition. Evelyn stood her ground, though her legs felt as though they would shatter. She was a fragile, small silhouette against the wall of hulking, desperate men. I have done nothing but keep you alive, she whispered, her voice cracking. They did not listen. They were past the point of reason. The starvation had stripped away their civility, and they were looking for a scapegoat to blame for the harsh reality of their situation. A heavy-set logger grabbed a wooden crate, preparing to smash it against the counter to get to her. Suddenly, a sound like a thunderclap echoed through the room. The heavy main door of the mess hall was ripped from its hinges by a single, powerful shove. Silas stood in the opening, his massive frame blocking out the light of the morning. His fur coat was dusted with fresh snow, and his face was a mask of such terrifying, cold fury that even the most desperate men recoiled. He did not say a word as he strode into the room, his heavy boots shaking the floorboards. He stopped in the center of the mob, his height making the other men appear small and insignificant. He looked at the men, then at the upturned benches, and finally at Evelyn, who stood trembling behind the serving table. Stand down, Silas commanded. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, dangerous growl that cut through the noise instantly. She is stealing from us. Silas, Brock shouted, pointing a thick, calloused finger at Evelyn. The meal is gone. She is taking it for herself. Silas turned his sharp, angular gaze toward Brock. He took one slow, deliberate step toward the man, his physique radiating a predatory, unstoppable power. You will not raise your voice in this hall, Silas said, his eyes drilling into Brock. And you will not threaten the woman who has kept you from eating your own boots for the last 3 weeks. Then where is the food? Brock challenged, his face flushed with rage and shame. We are starving. Silas glanced back at Evelyn. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of intense, dark conflict. He stood at the crossroads of his life, his duty to the men who had been his family for years, and the strange, blossoming, protective love he felt for this fragile widow. If he stood with her, he risked the mutiny he had spent months trying to avoid. If he surrendered her to their anger, he would lose the only piece of his heart that had started to beat again. The room held its breath. The silence was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear and longing, wondering if the man who had been her silent shield would finally decide that she was no longer worth the risk. Silas remained motionless. His presence was not merely a physical barrier between the petite, trembling woman and the angry mob. It was an undeniable, heavy command that suppressed the very air in the room. He turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping over the 30 men with a cold, piercing intensity that stripped away their justifications. You are hungry, Silas rumbled, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly timbre that vibrated in the chests of every man present. That does not give you the right to turn into a pack of wolves. I have watched you. I have watched Evelyn scrape the bottom of the barrels. I have watched her give away her own portions so you would not collapse in the yard. If you believe she is stealing, then you are not just hungry, you are fools who have forgotten the value of a true heart. He stepped closer to the table, his massive shadow enveloping the space where Brock stood. He did not raise a fist, nor did he draw a weapon. He relied entirely on the sheer, terrifying gravity of his character. The supplies are gone because the mountain took them, not because she took them, Silas continued, his eyes locking with Brock's. She is the only reason you are still drawing breath. She is the only reason this camp has not burned itself to the ground in a fit of cowardly panic. From this moment forward, she is under my absolute protection. Anyone who raises a hand or a voice against her will answer to me. Am I understood? The silence that followed was absolute. The men shifted on their feet, their gazes dropping to the rough-hewn floorboards. The shame began to wash over them, replacing the hot, blinding rage of their hunger. They knew the truth of his words. They knew that without Evelyn, the camp would have dissolved into chaos weeks ago. Brock took a shaky breath, his massive shoulders slumping. He looked at the floor, then briefly at Evelyn, his expression a mix of lingering frustration and deep, gojam remorse. We are just tired. Silas, Brock muttered, his voice barely audible. We are all tired, Silas replied, his voice remaining firm. But we do not let it turn us into monsters. Return to your tasks. All of you. The men dispersed slowly, their movements subdued and quiet. They filed out of the mess hall, leaving the room feeling vast, hollow, and suddenly cold. The lingering tension dissipated into the rafters, replaced by a heavy, somber atmosphere of reflection. Evelyn remained standing behind the counter, her hands gripping the edge of the wood so tightly that her knuckles were entirely white. The adrenaline was slowly receding, leaving her limbs feeling weak and heavy. She looked at the man who stood before her, the giant, scarred, stoic protector who had risked his own, standing within the crew to save her from their wrath. Silas turned toward her. The terrifying, cold fury that had filled his eyes seconds ago was gone, replaced by a raw, profound concern. He stepped around the counter, entering the small kitchen space that had been her sanctuary. He loomed over her, his presence no longer an intimidating force, but a shield, a source of unwavering, solid safety. Are you harmed? Silas asked, his voice softening to a register she had never heard before, a tone meant only for her. Stripped of all command and authority, Evelyn looked up at him, her large, sorrowful eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She felt a profound, overwhelming sense of emotional safety. For the first time since she had arrived at the camp, abandoned and terrified, she felt truly seen. She felt like she belonged to this place. And more importantly, she felt that he belonged to her. I am not hurt, Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I only fear what will happen when the rations truly run out. The theft. Someone is taking the food. Silas. I am certain of it. Silas nodded, his expression darkening as he processed the information. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand hovering just an inch from her shoulder, as if he wanted to touch her, but feared his own strength might break her. He pulled his hand back, clenching it into a fist at his side. I will find them, Silas promised, his voice a low vow. I will not let anyone threaten your efforts again. You are the heart of this camp. Evelyn, do not ever doubt that. Evelyn offered him a small, fragile smile, a sense of deep, quiet intimacy growing between them. The air in the room felt thick with an unspoken, budding longing that neither was yet ready to name. It was a connection born of mutual survival and the shared weight of the mountain's harsh, unyielding demands. The moment of peace was short-lived. The wind outside, which had been a constant, low moan, suddenly rose to a screeching, violent howl. The entire cabin groaned under a sudden, massive gust. The heavy, thick glass panes of the windows rattled in their frames as if they were being struck by stones. "The storm," Silas muttered, his gaze shifting to the ceiling. "It is changing." He was correct. The sky outside had turned from a dull, slate gray to a deep, bruising black. Snow began to fall in sheets, horizontal and blinding, whipped by wind that sounded like a freight train barreling down the mountain slope. It was a storm of unprecedented power, the kind that did not just dump snow, but sought to tear the very trees from the earth. Evelyn felt a surge of cold dread. She stepped toward the fireplace, throwing more wood onto the dying embers to keep the warmth within the mess hall. Silas moved to the door, peering out through the heavy iron slats to assess the danger. "The wind is creating a vortex," Silas shouted over the roaring gale, his hand gripping the door handle. "We have to secure the roof. If the snow piles up against the north wall, the pressure will." A sound like a cannon blast echoed through the canyon, a sharp, violent crack that cut through the thunder of the wind. Above their heads, the heavy wooden timbers of the roof shrieked in protest. A massive, ancient pine branch, weighted down by the rapid, heavy accumulation of ice and snow, snapped off the trunk of the towering tree directly beside the cabin. The weight of the limb was immense, a sprawling, jagged mass of wood and frozen debris. It slammed into the roof of the mess hall with a sickening, shuddering impact. The entire cabin tilted violently, the wooden beams splintering under the sudden, catastrophic load. The ceiling above the kitchen collapsed in a spray of dust, broken timber, and frozen snow. A heavy, jagged support beam fell directly toward the center of the kitchen, plummeting toward the spot where Evelyn stood frozen in terror. Silas did not hesitate. He launched himself across the narrow kitchen, his massive, muscular frame moving with the speed of a striking predator. He reached for her, his arms closing around her small, fragile waist, and pulled her toward the corner of the room just as the heavy, frozen beam crashed into the floor, exactly where she had been standing seconds before. The force of the collapse sent them both sprawling into the dust and darkness, the sound of the storm deafeningly loud through the gaping hole in the roof. Evelyn gasped, trapped beneath the weight of his broad, protective chest. The room was shrouded in swirling snow. She could hear Silas grunting, his body braced against the remaining structure, but he did not move. He lay perfectly still, his eyes wide, his sharp features etched with sudden, sharp pain. Outside, the storm continued its violent assault. But inside, a new, terrible silence reigned. Evelyn looked at Silas, her heart hammering against her ribs, as she realized he was not getting up. Who was trapped? And what price had the giant paid to ensure she remained untouched? The weight of the fallen timber was immense, a crushing force that seemed to push the very air from the room. Evelyn coughed as a cloud of fine, frozen sawdust swirled through the broken roof. She scrambled to her knees, her hands frantic as she clawed at the heavy, jagged wreckage. Beneath the splintered pine, Silas lay pinned, his massive body curled slightly to absorb the brunt of the impact that would have otherwise crushed her slender frame. He was motionless, his face pale and etched with lines of agony, his sharp eyes clamped shut. "Silas," Evelyn cried, her voice thin and ragged in the howling wind. "Please, look at me." The giant man let out a long, shuddering, breath. His massive chest heaved, and he slowly forced his eyes open. The intense, piercing blue of his gaze was clouded with shock and pain. He flexed his thick shoulders, the muscles beneath his coarse shirt rippling with effort. With a guttural groan that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin, he shoved the heavy beam upward. He did not ask for help. He simply used the last of his immense, fading strength to create a gap, rolling his massive physique out from beneath the weight. He collapsed onto the floorboards, his back thudding against the wall. He did not try to stand. He simply sat there, his head lolling forward, his breathing ragged and labored. Evelyn rushed to his side. She did not waste time with tears. She assessed the damage with the practiced, calm focus of someone who had long ago learned that panic was a luxury she could not afford. She ripped a strip of cloth from her apron and pressed it against a deep, angry gash on his shoulder where the beam had struck him. He winced, his teeth gritting together, but he did not pull away. "You are a fool," Silas rasped, his voice barely audible over the fury of the storm outside. "You should have run, and you are a stubborn, reckless man," Evelyn countered, her voice trembling but firm. She moved with purpose, gathering the few remaining blankets and piling them near the hearth, which had miraculously remained mostly intact. She helped him shuffle toward the fire, her strength failing as she tried to support his towering, dead weight. He allowed her to guide him, his massive arms draping heavily over her delicate shoulders. Once she had settled him near the flames, she turned to the task that would save them both from the creeping chill. She found her small, blackened pot and filled it with melted snow. She reached into her secret cache, retrieving a small, hard, dark root she had dried and ground weeks ago, the bitter, earthy chicory. It was not coffee, but in the depths of the mountain winter, it was the closest thing to comfort she possessed. She brewed the concoction over the fire, the bitter, dark scent curling into the air, masking the smell of wet timber and cold dust. She poured the liquid into 2 tin cups and sat beside the giant, pressing one into his massive, calloused hands. Silas wrapped his fingers around the cup. His hands were shaking, a stark contrast to the immovable, solid man who usually commanded the camp. He took a slow, deliberate sip. The warmth seemed to settle into his bones, and some of the pallor began to recede from his face. "Why do you stay?" Silas asked, his eyes fixed on the flickering orange light of the fire. "You are an educated woman. You possess grace and a spirit that belongs in the valley, not in a rotting timber camp at the end of the world." Evelyn looked into the dark, swirling liquid of her own cup. "I stayed because I had nowhere else to go. And because I found, for the first time, a place where my work mattered, where I was not just a widow, but a person." Silas turned his head to look at her, his expression softening into something devastatingly vulnerable. "I lost everything once. Evelyn, my wife, my child. The drought took their health, and the fever took their lives. I had nothing left to give, so I came here to bury myself in the work. I thought if I kept enough men alive, if I kept the machines turning, I could forgive myself for not saving them. But every time I looked at the table, every time I saw them hungry, I saw the faces of the people I failed." His voice broke, a jagged sound that tore at Evelyn's heart. He set the cup down, his large hands trembling against his knees. "I was not protecting them," Silas whispered, his gaze distant and haunted. "I was punishing myself. And then you arrived. You brought that pie, and you brought that strength, and you made me realize that I have been dead inside for a very long time. You reminded me what it is to be human." The confession hung in the air, heavy and profound. Evelyn reached out, her hand finding his. His skin was rough, scarred, and warm. She felt the depth of his grief, the vast, empty cavern where his hope had once resided. She knew that he was not just speaking about his past. He was speaking about the walls he had built around his heart, and how they were finally, painfully, beginning to crumble. "You do not have to carry that burden alone anymore," Evelyn murmured, her voice a soothing balm in the freezing dark. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. A silent question passing between them, an unspoken admission of a bond that had shifted from necessity to something far more dangerous and beautiful. But as the storm continued to beat against the walls, Evelyn's mind drifted to her own shadow. She had comforted him. She had offered him peace. But the truth of her own life remained a tightly coiled spring in her chest. She had not come to the mountains just to find work. She had fled a debt that was not monetary, but moral. She looked at Silas, seeing the man who had laid down his life to save hers, and she felt a wave of agonizing guilt. What would he think if he knew the true reason her husband had died, and the secret she had kept buried beneath the floorboards of her own soul? The morning light crawled through the jagged hole in the roof, illuminating the dancing dust motes and the wreckage of the mess hall. Silas remained near the hearth, his shoulder heavily bandaged with clean strips of linen Evelyn had fashioned from her own underskirt. He was weak, the paleness of his skin betraying the severity of his injury. Yet he refused to rest. He sat on a sturdy wooden chair, his gaze fixed on the front door, his hand resting near the heavy iron axe he kept at his side. Evelyn busied herself with the final, precious remnants of the cornmeal. Her hands moved with a rhythmic, mechanical precision, but her thoughts were far away. She was thinking of the valley, of the suffocating scent of stale cigar smoke in a gambling den, and of the man, a tall, shadows-clad agent of a debt she could never repay, who had promised to find her. She felt like a trapped animal, the walls of the mountain closing in on her, despite the vast, open wilderness outside. A heavy, rhythmic thumping sounded against the main cabin door. Silas straightened, his jaw locking into a hard, defensive line. He gestured for Evelyn to stand behind the serving counter, out of the line of sight from the entrance. She obeyed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. The heavy door groaned open. A tall, lean man stepped inside, his long coat caked in thick, frozen slush. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his features, and his eyes, cold, sharp, and reptilian, immediately swept the room. He did not look like a man lost in a storm. He looked like a man who knew exactly where he was going. "I seek shelter," the stranger declared, his voice smooth, oily, and entirely devoid of genuine desperation. "The pass is treacherous, and my horse collapsed a mile back." Silas stood, bracing himself against the table. He was a mountain of a man even in his weakened state, and his presence remained a formidable obstacle. "The camp is closed to visitors. You will find no quarter here," the stranger chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that set Evelyn's teeth on edge. He stepped further into the light, pushing his hat back. He was Cleanshaven, his face possessing a harsh, angular quality that reminded Evelyn of a predatory bird. He was not a traveler. He was a collector. "I do not seek charity," the man replied, his gaze drifting past Silas, locking onto the kitchen counter where Evelyn stood. "I seek a specific woman. A widow, they say. One who has a habit of leaving her debts unpaid." Evelyn felt the breath leave her lungs. The name of the man, Danton, flashed through her mind. He was the hound of the man who had driven her husband to his early grave. Silas stepped forward, his massive form blocking Danton's view of Evelyn. The movement cost him. A sheen of cold sweat broke out across his brow, and he winced. But his expression remained a mask of pure, lethal intent. You will leave this camp immediately. You are not welcome here. Danton smiled. A thin, cruel stretch of lips. He reached into his coat and produced a crumpled, mud-stained piece of paper. He unfolded it with agonizing slowness. I am a man of business. Lumberjack. Her husband owed a sum that reached deep into the thousands. When he met his unfortunate end, the debt did not vanish. It transferred to her. I am here to collect, either in coin or in labor, or in whatever form of payment the law allows. He gestured vaguely toward the kitchen. Come out. Evelyn. The cold is biting, and I have no desire to freeze while negotiating with a man who can barely stand. Evelyn stepped out from behind the counter. Her face was deathly pale, but her spine was straight. She would not hide behind Silas any longer. She would not let him be broken further on her account. I have no money, Danton, she stated, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I have already paid enough. You paid nothing, Danton countered, his eyes hungrily scanning her delicate features. You ran, and that added interest to the account. Now, you are coming with me. The master expects a return on his investment. Silas growled, a low, guttural sound that seemed to rumble from the very earth beneath them. He took another step toward Danton, his massive hand closing around the haft of his axe. She is staying here. You will walk out that door, or I will carry you out in pieces. Danton laughed, though his eyes remained cold and calculating. He looked at Silas's bandaged shoulder, the bloodstain seeping through the linen. He saw the weakness. You are dying, giant. That wound is festering, and your legs are shaking like a newborn calf. Do not pretend you can protect her. I have men waiting at the base of the trail. If I do not return by nightfall, they will burn this camp to the ground, starting with the food stores you prize so highly. Evelyn felt a surge of pure, freezing terror. The threat was not empty. Danton was a man who operated in the shadows, a man who burned what he could not possess. If Silas fought him, Silas would likely die, or the entire camp would suffer the consequences of Danton's cruelty. Silas. Stop, Evelyn whispered, stepping between them. She looked up at the giant, her eyes filled with a heartbreaking mixture of love and desperation. Do not fight him. It is my debt. It is my life. Silas ignored her. He looked at Danton, his gaze heavy with a dark, ancient resolve. This is not your land, Silas muttered, his voice cold as the ice outside. And she is not your property. She is a contract, Danton hissed, his veneer of civility slipping to reveal the malice beneath. And I intend to fulfill it. He reached into his jacket, his hand moving with the practiced speed of a gunfighter. Silas reacted, but his injured shoulder betrayed him. He lurched, his strength failing for a split second. The delay was slight, but it was enough. Danton leveled his weapon, his gaze shifting to Evelyn with a look of predatory triumph. The tension in the room was absolute, a wire pulled to the point of snapping. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the suffocating silence. Silas, caught in the grip of his own failing body and the overwhelming weight of the decision before him, stared at the man who would take the only light he had found in years. Would he sacrifice the safety of the entire camp to save her? Or would he allow the cold, hard logic of survival to dictate the end of their story? The metallic click of the pistol hammer being pulled back echoed through the cabin like a death knell. Evelyn stood paralyzed, her heart pounding against her ribs with the force of a trapped bird. She watched the barrel of the weapon sway, leveled squarely at Silas's massive, heaving chest. Danton's face was a mask of cold, predatory satisfaction. He knew that the giant was broken, that the wound on his shoulder was sapping the strength from his frame, and that the camp was a desperate, starving collection of men who had no love left to fight for a stranger. Silas did not look at the gun. He kept his gaze locked on Danton's eyes, his own dark, amber orbs burning with a fierce, quiet intensity. He breathed heavily, the pain of his festering wound etched clearly into the tense lines of his face. He knew the math of the situation as well as the collector did. If he attempted to lunge, the bullet would find its mark, and the consequences for the camp would be immediate and catastrophic. If he yielded, he lost everything. "Do not," Evelyn whispered, her voice a fragile, broken sound in the heavy silence. "Silas, please, do not throw your life away for me." Silas turned his head, just an inch, to look at her. The sight of her, terrified, trembling, yet standing between him and the darkness, seemed to settle something within him. His expression shifted from predatory rage to a profound, weary calm. He reached into the heavy coat that lay draped over the nearby table, his movements slow and deliberate. Danton's finger tightened on the trigger, his knuckles white. "Wait," Silas commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that stopped the man in his tracks. Silas withdrew a heavy, iron-bound ledger from the interior pocket of his coat. It was a weather-beaten book, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. He tossed it onto the wooden table between them. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "That is the deed to the timber claim," Silas stated, his gaze never leaving Danton's. "Every mature tree, every acre of land, every contract for the coming harvest. It is worth more than $10,000 in the valley markets. It is the lifeblood of this camp, the wages for every man who stands outside those walls, and the only fortune I have built with my own hands over the last decade." Danton blinked, his eyes flickering toward the book with a sudden, sharp greed. He hesitated, his weapon wavering. "You would trade your life's work for a widow?" "I would trade the whole world for her," Silas replied, his voice devoid of doubt. "Take it. Leave the deed. Take the land, and get off this mountain. If I see you again, I will not care about the law, and I will not care about my own survival. I will find you." The air in the room felt electrified. Evelyn stared at the ledger, then at Silas. She knew what that book represented. It was not just paper and ink, it was the stability of the entire camp. It was the promise of food, of supplies, and of future security for the 30 men who had nowhere else to go. By sacrificing the ledger, Silas was sacrificing the camp's future, rendering them penniless and at the mercy of the elements. It was a sacred sacrifice, one that stripped him of his power to ensure their survival, all to secure her freedom. Danton lowered the weapon, his greed finally outweighing his malice. He snatched the ledger from the table, his fingers flipping through the pages to confirm the signatures and the legal seals. A cruel grin spread across his thin lips. "A foolish trade. Giant," Danton muttered, tucking the ledger inside his coat. "You have bought her freedom with the hunger of your own men. I wonder how long they will thank you for this when they realize they have nothing left to trade Evelyn for winter stores." He turned on his heel and strode toward the door. He did not look back. He did not care about the ruin he left behind. He only cared about the profit he carried in his pocket. The heavy door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a finality that shook the very foundation of the building. The moment the man was gone, the fight left Silas. His legs gave way, and he slumped backward into his chair, his head dropping against his chest. His breathing became erratic, his face turning an alarming shade of gray. The effort of the confrontation had pushed him far past the limits of his endurance. Evelyn rushed to his side, her hands frantic as she pressed them to his forehead. He was burning with fever. The wound on his shoulder was dark, inflamed, and oozing a thin, sickly fluid. He had been fighting off the infection for days, hiding the agony to keep the men in line. And now, the strain had finally shattered his defenses. "Silas, look at me," she urged, her voice soft and desperate. He cracked one eye open, the intense blue light within it dimmed and unfocused. Is he gone?" "He is gone," Evelyn confirmed, her heart aching as she stroked the hair back from his sweat-slicked brow. "You are safe now." "I am not safe," Silas whispered, a weak, dry chuckle escaping his throat. "I have just gambled away our future. They will hate me. Evelyn, when the men find out the claim is gone, they will have no reason to stay. They will leave, and the camp will die." "Let him leave," Evelyn murmured, her hand resting over his heart. "We have the shelter, we have the hearth, and we have each other. We will find a way to survive, just as we always have. You did not gamble away our future, Silas. You bought us a chance to start over." He closed his eyes, a small, painful smile touching his lips. He was drifting, his strength failing him entirely. Evelyn sat with him, the silence of the cabin now heavy with the weight of what they had lost and the terrifying uncertainty of what lay ahead. She had traded his security for her life, and now she had to face the reality of the consequences. She knew that when the sun rose, the men would realize the truth, and the sanctuary they had built would crumble into dust. Would the men understand the sacrifice he made for her? Or would the news of their lost livelihood trigger a final, irrevocable betrayal? The silence within the cabin was absolute, save for the ragged, shallow breathing of the giant lying upon the narrow cot. Evelyn hovered over him, her hands stained with medicinal herbs and cold water. She had spent the last 2 days fighting the fire that raged through his blood. His fever was a relentless, punishing thing, but as the sun reached its zenith on the 3rd day, the heat finally began to break. Silas stirred. His massive eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes that were no longer clouded with delirium, but heavy with a profound, weary clarity. He looked around the room, his gaze resting finally on Evelyn. She was sitting in a small wooden chair nearby, her head bowed as she mended the hem of her apron. "The men," Silas croaked, his voice like gravel grinding against stone. "Have they come?" Evelyn set her needle down and stood, moving to his side to place a cool, damp cloth against his forehead. "They have remained in the barracks. Thomas and Brock have been checking the wood piles. They know you are ill, and they respect the boundaries you set. They do not know about the deed. Silas, I have kept the ledger's departure a quiet matter." Silas let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension in his broad shoulders finally beginning to subside. He shifted, his body wincing as the wound on his shoulder protested the movement. It will not stay hidden forever. When the thaw comes, or when the next inspector arrives, the reality will become impossible to ignore. Evelyn leaned closer, her eyes locked with his. "Then we will deal with that when the time comes. For now, you must focus on your recovery." Over the next week, the giant began to mend. His constitution was as formidable as his physique, and the deep, lacerating gash on his shoulder knit together with surprising speed. As he regained his strength, he grew restless, his eyes constantly scanning the cabin, his hands twitching with the need for labor. One evening, he rose from his cot, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked to the center of the cabin, his massive frame casting a long shadow against the pine logs. He began to drag the heavy, unfinished stones from the corner, stones he had been collecting for years with the vague, long-abandoned intention of improving his hearth. Evelyn watched him, her hands stilling as she prepared a simple pot of pinto beans. "You should be resting, Silas. You are nowhere near recovered." Silas did not stop. He maneuvered a massive slab of granite into place, with a grunt of exertion. "I have lived in this cabin for a decade, and I have treated it as a place to exist, not a place to live. It is cold, and the cooking arrangements are primitive. That ends now." He spent the next 3 days in a flurry of purposeful activity. He labored under the dim light of the oil lamps, his muscles rippling as he shaped the stone and mortar. He was building a new hearth, a massive, beautiful structure of river stone and iron. It was a centerpiece, a symbol of domestic permanence that stood in direct contradiction to his previous existence as a wandering, reclusive man of the timber camps. Evelyn watched him from the corner, her heart aching with a mixture of wonder and profound, terrifying love. She realized he was not just building a stove. He was carving a space for her. He was carving a space for them. When the hearth was finished, it was a masterpiece of function and design. He had installed a heavy iron crane that swung with ease, and the stones were fitted with the precision of a craftsman. He signaled to her one evening as the fire began to roar, turning the interior into a sanctuary of warmth. "Come," he invited, his voice deep and steady. Evelyn approached, feeling the heat radiate from the structure. He had prepared 2 bowls of pinto beans, seasoned only with salt and the last of the wild onions. It was a simple, humble meal, the kind that had kept them alive through the deepest stretches of the winter. Yet as they sat before the new hearth, it tasted like a feast. The intimacy of the moment was overwhelming. They sat on the floor, the firelight dancing across Silas's sharp, masculine features. He looked at her, his expression unguarded, the walls he had built around his heart seemingly dissolved. "I have spent my life preparing for the end," Silas murmured, his eyes searching hers. "I thought my duty was to survive until the day the mountain finally claimed me. But tonight, for the first time, I am looking toward the morning." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat. She reached out, placing her hand over his. His palm was warm, his touch anchoring her. "I have spent my life running, Silas. I have spent it hiding from depths and shadows. Tonight, I feel as though I have finally stopped." They sat in comfortable silence. The only sound, the crackle of the flames and the howling of the wind against the cabin walls. It was a silent, intense commitment, a recognition that despite the looming threats, despite the loss of the claim, and despite the uncertainty of the spring, they had found a place where they belonged. Suddenly, the cabin shuddered. The sound was not the usual groan of settling timber. It was a deep, resonant boom that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the mountain. The oil lamps flickered violently. The dust rained down from the rafters. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his instinct for danger overriding his physical weakness. He strode to the heavy wooden door and threw it open, his face turning ashen as he looked into the darkness. "What is it?" Evelyn asked, standing behind him, her eyes widening as she saw the sky. The horizon was obscured by a wall of white that was rising to meet the clouds. It was a storm unlike any she had seen, a vortex of absolute, blinding fury that promised to swallow the camp whole. The wind had become a physical entity, a concussive force that threatened to buckle the very beams of the cabin. "The deadliest blizzard of the decade," Silas whispered, his voice cold with realization. It is hitting us from all sides. We will not be able to hold the walls if the snow drifts reach the roof line." As he spoke, the cabin buckled again, the roof joists screaming under an invisible, crushing weight. The first sheet of ice shattered against the window, and the cabin began to shake, as if the earth itself were trying to buck them off. Would the hearth he had built be enough to keep them alive? Or was this the final destructive force the mountain had been waiting to unleash? The wind was not merely weather, it was a living, breathing entity that intended to scour the mountain of every man-made structure. The roar outside became a constant, deafening vibration that rattled the very marrow of Evelyn's bones. Inside the cabin, the new hearth fire flickered wildly as the draft sucked the heat toward the cracks in the ceiling. A sharp, terrifying sound tore through the cacophony, the unmistakable splintering of aged pine. Silas spun toward the center of the room. A massive support beam, running the length of the ceiling, bowed under the weight of the accumulated ice on the roof above. A web of cracks raced across the wood, glowing white under the pressure. If that beam failed, the entire roof would collapse, crushing the cabin and everything within it. Silas did not hesitate. He moved with a speed that defied his recent injury. He abandoned his axe, crossed the room in 2 long strides, and thrust his massive shoulders against the bowing timber. His muscles, corded and thick, stood out like iron cables beneath his sweat-drenched shirt. He let out a low, guttural roar as he braced himself, his hands locking onto the wood. The beam groaned, the splintering slowing, as he took the burden of the mountain's weight upon his own frame. Evelyn watched in horror. The roof was shuddering, snow and ice cascading down through the gaps in the boards. She knew that he could not hold it indefinitely. The sheer weight of the frozen snowdrift was too much for any human, no matter how strong, to endure for long. "Silas!" she screamed, her voice lost in the thunder of the storm. He did not answer. His face was a mask of extreme, agonizing concentration. Veins pulsed in his neck, and his boots dug deep furrows into the floorboards as he pushed upward, fighting to keep the gap between the beam and the floor from closing. Evelyn's mind raced. She could not lift the beam. She was not made of the same iron and steel as the man who held it. But she could control the environment. She could fuel the fire that kept the cabin warm, and she could keep him alive. She scrambled to the hearth. She grabbed the pot of bean broth that had been simmering since their meal. It was thick, hearty, and full of the slow-burning sustenance he required. She ladled it into a large tin cup, adding a generous pinch of salt to replenish what he was surely losing in sweat. She moved to his side, sliding under the reach of the heavy beam. He was trembling, his body vibrating with the effort of holding the roof against the sky. She pressed the cup to his lips. "Drink," she commanded, her voice fierce and steady. He parted his lips, allowing her to tip the broth into his mouth. He swallowed, the warm, savory liquid providing a momentary flash of strength. His eyes met hers, and in that fleeting contact, she saw the depths of his exhaustion. He was pouring his life force into the wood, refusing to let the mountain win, refusing to let the cabin and her be buried. "You must hold," she whispered, a prayer as much as an instruction. "I will keep the fire. I will keep you warm." She spent the next hour in a state of frantic, focused motion. She fed the hearth, ensuring the fire roared high to fight the freezing air encroaching from the hole in the roof. She ran back to him, again and again, offering the broth, wiping the sweat from his brow, pressing her hands against his back to provide whatever tiny anchor she could against the crushing force. Outside, the storm shrieked, a relentless, punishing gale that seemed determined to break the man who stood against it. Snow sifted through the broken ceiling, coating Silas's hair and shoulders in white, but he did not buckle. He stood like a colossus, a giant of flesh and bone, defying the winter. Evelyn watched him, her heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it threatened to consume her. She was witnessing the definition of sacrifice. He was giving every ounce of his remaining strength, every reserve of his body, to ensure she was safe. She looked at his hands, gripped tightly to the wood, and saw the skin breaking, the wood splintering into his palms. She felt the urge to weep, but she pushed it aside. Tears were not enough. She had to be his strength when his failed. "You are the heart of this mountain," she murmured, her cheek resting against his heaving back. "Do not let go. Please, do not let go." He let out a ragged, strangled sound, a mix of grunt and prayer. He shifted his stance, his muscles bunching with renewed, desperate intensity. The beam held. The roof, though groaned and bowed, did not fall. The hours stretched into an eternity. The storm raged, but the cabin stood. Slowly, agonizingly, the violent thrum of the wind began to diminish. The savage frequency of the gusts subsided, replaced by a low, mournful wail that signaled the end of the blizzard's peak. The weight on the beam remained, but it was no longer growing. The mountain had done its worst, and they were still standing. Evelyn continued to stoke the fire, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked at Silas. He was still standing, still pushing, but his posture had begun to falter. The color had drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly, translucent gray. The massive, bulging muscles of his back, usually so defined, were trembling uncontrollably. "Silas," she said, her voice soft. "The storm is breaking. You can rest." He did not reply. He did not move. She walked to the front of him, sliding her body between him and the beam. She looked up at his face. His eyes were open, staring at a fixed point in the air, unseeing. His hands were locked into the wood, frozen into place by the sheer, terrifying force of his will. "Silas," she cried, grabbing his arms. He did not react. He remained as rigid as the timber he supported. She pulled at his arms, trying to break his grip, but his muscles were petrified, locked in the stance of his final, ultimate effort. With a soft, muffled sound, his knees buckled. He did not fall, he collapsed. He slid down the support beam, his body hitting the floor with a heavy, sickening thud. The beam, no longer held by his massive strength, dropped an inch, settling into its new, bowed position. It held, but the man who had been its pillar did not stir. Evelyn threw herself down beside him, her hands hovering over his chest, terrified to touch him, terrified that he was already gone. She pressed her ear to his heart. It was beating, a slow, irregular, labored thudding that sounded like a drum submerged in water. He was breathing, but it was a shallow, ragged intake of air that barely filled his lungs. His skin was ice cold. He had burned through everything. He had consumed his own vitality to keep the roof above them. And now, he lay broken in the wreckage of his own sacrifice. The storm outside had passed, but in the silence of the cabin, a new, colder terror took root. She looked around the shattered room, at the leaking roof and the cold hearth, and then back at the giant, whose life was flickering out like a dying candle. Will he survive the night? Or has his final act of courage cost him the very future he had begun to hope for? The silence in the cabin was heavy, broken only by the whistling of the wind retreating across the mountain peaks and the ragged, Shallow intake of Silas's breath. Evelyn knelt on the rough wooden floorboards, her fingers trembling as she pulled the heavy wool blankets over his massive, inert form. He looked so small in the dim light of the dying fire, a mountain of a man reduced to a state of absolute, fragile stillness. The cold seemed to radiate from his skin, a deep, bone-chilling frost that spoke of the immense toll his body had paid. She crawled toward the hearth, her movements stiff and aching. In the corner of her wooden crate, hidden beneath a layer of linens, lay a single, shriveled apple. It was the only piece of fresh fruit she had managed to tuck away weeks ago. A small, forgotten treasure that she had saved for a day when she could truly celebrate. It was wrinkled, the skin tough and leathery, but it held the scent of an orchard in late autumn. She retrieved a small, sharp paring knife. With slow, steady hands, she began to peel the skin. The long, curling ribbon of red skin fell to the floor, and the sweet, tart aroma filled the small, suffocating space. She was not just preparing food, she was performing a ritual. She was peeling back the layers of her own past, exposing the raw, aching truth she had kept buried since the day she stepped onto the mountain. "You are so strong," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible, directed at the unconscious man. "You gave everything to keep the roof over my head. You gave your strength, your future, and your very life. You do not understand why I cook. You do not understand why I cannot let a man go hungry." She cut the apple into thin, translucent slices, placing them into a small pot of water with a dash of honey she had traded for weeks ago. As the water simmered, she leaned her forehead against the edge of the cot. "My husband was not a bad man," she confessed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "He was a desperate one. When the debts arrived, when the collectors circled our home like vultures, he did not run. He did not fight. He simply stopped eating. He claimed he was not hungry, that he had already eaten, that the soup tasted too rich for his stomach. I believed him, for a while. I was so young, so foolish, so blind to the hollowness in his eyes. The smell of the stewed apples began to rise. A sweet, healing perfume that fought against the scent of wet wood and cold ash. "I found out the truth on the last night," she continued, her voice trembling. "I found his journals hidden beneath the floorboards. He had been recording every grain of rice, every slice of bread he had denied himself so that I could maintain my health. He was paying off the interest with his own life. He starved himself until he could no longer stand, and then he simply closed his eyes and left me alone in a house filled with debt." She lifted the pot from the fire, the apples now soft and golden. She sat back down beside Silas, her heart breaking all over again. "I swore on his grave that I would never, ever let another man go hungry," she murmured, a tear slipping down her cheek. "When I saw the state of this camp, when I saw the rot in the larder, I felt as though I were back in that house. I felt the same terror, the same suffocating weight of failure. That is why I cook. That is why I scrape the bottom of the pot. It is not just service, Silas. It is penance. It is the only way I know how to keep the ghost of his sacrifice from consuming me." She took a small spoon, lifted a piece of the soft apple, and pressed it to Silas's pale, cracked lips. "You did not have to give your life for me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But you did. You are just like him." She held the spoon to his mouth, waiting, praying for a sign, a breath, a movement. Silas's chest heaved, a long, ragged exhale that sounded like the turning of a heavy tide. His eyelids flickered, the dark lashes trembling against his weathered cheek. He let out a low, guttural sound, and his mouth parted. He took the fruit. He swallowed, the effort visible in the way his throat moved. His eyes slowly, agonizingly, drifted open. They were bloodshot, weary, and unfocused, but as they locked onto Evelyn's face, a flicker of awareness returned. He looked at the pot, at the spoon, and then at the tears staining her cheeks. "You," Silas rasped, his voice a dry, broken whisper. "You were never the failure, Evelyn." He reached out, his massive, calloused hand finding hers. It was weak, his grip barely a ghost of his usual strength, but it was anchored in a profound, absolute sincerity. "The debt. It was not your burden to carry," he murmured, his gaze holding hers, with a depth of empathy that made her breath hitch. "You did not starve him. You loved him. And you have kept us all alive. You are not penance. You are the grace of this camp." His head fell back against the pillow, his eyes closing, but his fingers remained locked with hers. He had heard her. He had understood the secret that had defined her existence, and he had stripped the shame from it, leaving only the truth. The fire crackled, casting a warm, golden glow across their joined hands. The storm outside had truly ended, the wind now nothing more than a faint, distant sigh in the pines. The exhaustion that had been clutching her soul for months began to recede, replaced by a strange, quiet peace. She had told the truth, and she had not been destroyed by it. She had been saved. The dawn was coming. The heavy, oppressive weight of the winter was lifting, and for the first time in her life, Evelyn did not look toward the horizon with fear. She looked at the man beside her, the giant who had fought the mountain and won. And she knew that whatever the new day brought, she would not face it alone. But, as the first pale light of morning began to filter through the cracks in the walls, the reality of their isolation remained. They were still at the top of the world. Their ledger was gone, and their strength was spent. What would the new dawn demand of them? And could they truly build a life together, when everything else had been stripped away? The sun that rose over the mountain peak was no longer a pale, distant winter orb. It was warm, golden, and possessed the insistent, transformative heat of early spring. The heavy blanket of snow that had held the camp in a suffocating grip began to weep, turning into thousands of tiny, trickling rivulets that carved paths through the mud. The mountain was waking up. Evelyn stood on the porch of the mess hall, breathing in the scent of wet pine and thawing earth. She felt a lightness in her chest that she had not known in years. Behind her, the door creaked open. Silas stepped out. He moved with a slight, lingering stiffness, his shoulders still healing, but he stood tall. He was no longer the man who had been consumed by the ghosts of his past. He was present, whole, and looking at the world with eyes that saw a future rather than a grave. The lumberjacks had gathered in the yard. They were silent, their expressions unreadable, as they stared at their foreman. News of the lost ledger had traveled through the barracks like wildfire. They knew their legal standing was gone. They knew the company, if it ever arrived, would find nothing to claim. Silas walked to the edge of the porch, his shadow stretching long across the thawing ground. He did not look at the men with shame. He looked at them with the steady, piercing gaze of a leader. "The deed to this claim is gone," Silas announced, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet clearing. "I traded it to secure the safety of a woman who has given this camp more than any company contract ever could. I do not ask for your forgiveness for that choice. I would make it again every single time." A heavy silence followed. Evelyn held her breath, her hand finding the rough wood of the railing. Brock stepped forward, his massive, hulking frame seemingly smaller, humbled by the trials of the winter. He looked at Silas, then at the mess hall door where Evelyn stood. He scratched his beard, a slow, thoughtful gesture. "We have been cutting timber all winter." "Silas," Brock rumbled, his voice lacking its previous bite. "The logs are stacked in the yard, ready to float. If we do not have a contract to honor, we do not have a master to serve." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the men. "We do not need the company," another man added, nodding toward the swelling river that roared with the melt. "The river is high. If we push the timber now, we can reach the market ourselves. We can sell the wood on our own terms. We do not need a piece of paper to tell us what our work is worth." Silas stared at his crew, a slow, profound realization dawning on his weathered face. He had spent years believing he was the sole protector of these men, the one who held their lives in his hands. He realized now that they were not just laborers, they were a community. They had survived because they worked together, because they chose to stay, and because they had found, in the heart of the winter, a sense of belonging that transcended their work. "Then we moved the timber," Silas said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "We work for ourselves." A cheer went up, not a roar of drunken celebration, but a quiet, earnest sound of men who had claimed their own destiny. Evelyn watched as the men dispersed to their work, their energy renewed, their purpose unified. The crushing weight of the debt was gone, replaced by the honest, hard promise of independent labor. She felt a hand rest gently on her shoulder. "We are free, Evelyn," Silas whispered, his voice warm against her ear. "The winter is over. We have no masters, and we have no debts." He turned to face her, his massive frame blocking out the glare of the morning sun. He looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. He reached into his pocket and produced a small, smooth stone he had picked from the foundation of the new hearth. He took her hand, his fingers calloused and strong, and placed the stone into her palm. "I built this home to keep the warmth inside," he murmured, his eyes locking with hers. "I did not know if I was building it for myself, or for the memory of the life I lost. But I know now. I built it for you." He stepped closer, his presence enveloping her. "I am a man of few words, and I have spent most of my life in silence. But I have realized that silence is not the same as peace. I do not want to be alone on this mountain anymore. I want to build a life here, not just a camp, but a home. I want you to be a part of that, not as a cook, but as my wife." Evelyn felt the tears prick her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of joy, and of an overwhelming, long-awaited belonging. She closed her fingers around the stone, the weight of it a promise of the earth beneath their feet. "I have spent my life waiting to be found," Evelyn replied, her voice steady and clear. "I have spent my life waiting for a home. I am here, Silas. I am finally here." That evening, they gathered for a final meal, the last of the pinto beans, a fresh batch of hoe cakes made from the final, precious sack of cornmeal, and a simple tea brewed from the first, tender needles of the spring spruce. It was a feast of gratitude. The men sat around the long table, the atmosphere filled with a profound, communal joy. They told stories of the winter, laughing at the hardships that had once seemed impossible to bear. They toasted to the spring, to the river, and to the fragile widow who had turned their cold, dark kitchen into the heart of their lives. Evelyn sat beside Silas, their hands linked beneath the table. She looked around the room, seeing the warmth in the eyes of the men, the light in the hearth, and the steady, unbreakable presence of the man who had traded his fortune for her freedom. The mountain, which had once been a place of exile, had become their sanctuary. They had faced the frost and the famine, the doubt and the fear, and they had emerged not merely as survivors, but as a family. The firelight danced on the walls, a flickering promise of the nights to come. The winter was truly gone, and in its place, the promise of a life earned through courage, tempered by suffering, and forged in the simple, steady act of sharing a meal. They had walked through the fire, and they had found the warmth of a hearth that would never grow cold. We have walked a long path together, through the biting frost of the mountain pass and into the thawing light of this final spring. This story was never truly about the food. Even though those simple, humble meals, the water pie, the potato soup, the hoe cakes, were the threads that held these souls together. It was a story about the meals we feed to one another when the world is at its coldest. It was about the sustenance of dignity, the nourishment of belonging, and the radical, life-saving act of caring for a stranger when you are starving yourself. Silas and Evelyn were two broken people who thought their stories had ended in tragedy. Yet they learned that the most profound healing often happens in the quietest moments. In the sharing of a bowl of beans, in the mending of a shirt, in the silent, stubborn choice to keep the fire burning when everything else has gone cold. They teach us that hard times do not define us. Our response to them does. They show us that strength is not always found in the brawn of a giant or the roar of a storm, but in the quiet, consistent act of staying, of serving, and of opening your heart to a second chance. May you always find a hearth that welcomes you, a meal that warms your spirit, and a partner who stands with you when the roof threatens to cave in. Thank you for walking this road with them, and for letting their story travel to wherever you are in this wide, beautiful world. May your own winter always lead to a spring of your own making. This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The recipes and methods described, while inspired by historical culinary practices from difficult economic periods, should be used for informational purposes only. Please consult appropriate, modern food safety guidelines when preparing meals. This content is intended for entertainment and educational reflection on themes of resilience and community.